welcome to the Early Years Summit with me, Kathy Brodie. This summit is all about speech, language and communication, and today we're looking at the links between speech and language and literacy, and I'm just delighted to be joined by Kirstie Page, who qualified as a speech and language therapist in 1996 and then retrained as a teacher in 2004. Kirstie taught within Key Stage 1 and the EYFS before shifting her focus to the training and support of other practitioners whilst continuing to work hands-on within schools and settings. She's founded and developed Launchpad for Literacy, which is all about children, the skills they have and the skills they need for all aspects of literacy, including identifying speech, language and other developmental needs as soon as possible. A very warm welcome to the Early Years Summit, Kirstie Page.
Thank you for asking me. I'm really pleased to be here.
Oh, I'm just delighted that you found time to come on because Launchpad for Literacy is really, really interesting and we will come on to that. But I'd like to start with the speech and language aspect. How does speech and language support other areas of children's development?
Well, that's kind of a very big question, which I'll try to answer quite succinctly. I think, in my opinion, speech, language and communication underpins so much about other aspects of child development. So if we think about it, first and foremost, it underpins children's ability to interact and engage with other people. And by doing so, that's where learning begins. It's how they form relationships. It's how emotional understanding can develop and children can begin to understand their emotions more and manage their emotions through their interactions with other adults and then later with other children. But it's also a positive cycle. So once I can have those early communication skills to interact with people, to tune into faces, to tune into voices, that's where I start to learn words, to understand words and begin to use words and join words myself. So that in those very early years, those interactions are about you as an adult helping me learn how to talk, to develop language skills. And it doesn't end there, though, because once I've learned to talk and understand words, this is where I then begin to we interact and talk to learn, so that it is by sharing conversations about my environment, about the outside world, about nature, about these resources that we're sharing together, about this story that we're reading together. It's that language that is used and those interactions around those activities that allow me to begin to understand about my world and to learn from stories and all those other kind of rich experiences. So the link in the early years between language development and learning couldn't be stronger, to be honest. They're so intertwined. And a colleague of mine who I've known for many years, who is now a fantastic lady called Claire Nicholson, who's head of Pennywell Early Years Centre. Years ago, she once said to me, quality teaching is all about quality interactions. And way back then I thought, gosh, yes, you're so right. It is through that sharing of experiences that children learn. And if you've got a communication difficulty where tuning into people and interacting with people is problematic for you, then that whole learning journey then becomes problematic. If you want to tune into people, but you often don't understand what they're saying because maybe they've used sentences that are too long or words that you don't know yet, then again, that intention of helping you learn can be problematic because your language skills become a barrier. So I often talk to schools. I work a lot with schools as well as with settings. I often talk about how developmental needs in the early years can morph into learning needs as children get older, because that language barrier or that communication barrier has been a barrier to that learning. So as we begin to measure not academic, but early learning outcomes, we see gaps in that kind of development and that progress. But actually that all stemmed for many children from that developmental gap that was there at the beginning. But I also think, as well as learning, language is fundamental to play development. So I as an ex-speech and language therapist, I used to love it that I went out and about into settings, because I used to just love watching how children engaged with each other, but engaged with the learning environment as well. And what we find is that for many children who have got language delay, and particularly children with what you would call disordered language development, if I watch them in a setting, what they choose, where they go, and most importantly, where they don't go, I can often see quite a limited play repertoire that play, particularly when it's social and collaborative play, can be problematic, but also play that is very symbolic. So creative play, where I have to use language skills to generate an idea and manifest that in something that I've drawn or painted or glued together. And also pretend play and role play. Those types of play are very correlated with language development, to the point where many moons ago, when I used to, as a therapist, see, say, for example, 2-year-olds who were very late talkers, I often used to talk to parents about play first and say, all right, well, and often these children didn't pretend. So one of my kind of pieces of advice to take away was, if you can, get somebody to give you, or go, if it's a birthday coming up, go out and buy a tea set and some toy food. Because we can see that language affects play, but also if we nurture play, we can boost language as well. So learning and play, social and emotional development, obviously. The core of social development begins with those relationships I attach initially to those familiar adults. But a lot of children who struggle to maintain those relationships, form those relationships, but also to develop more complex skills such as taking turns in play, understanding things from somebody else's point of view, understanding that they are very important, but they are also one of a group once they get into kind of settings and into schools. A lot of what we often see as issues with personal, social, and emotional can often be underpinned by issues with social communication needs, that ability to see things from another person's point of view, that ability to use language to do things like initiate conversations, to ask for help, to ask to join in. So it's very difficult to look at PSED without considering comprehension and also social communication skills, and not kind of getting the two mixed up, but by proxy, understanding more about language, and particularly understanding more about social communication and pragmatic development, we can begin to have a much more targeted approach to PSED and those social communication behaviours we're wanting to see. And I think the other thing is obviously we've talked about learning generally, but also mathematical development. Conceptual understanding, the ability to understand linguistic concepts. So the very obvious one of size and shape, but also more and less and longer and shorter. All of that kind of mathematical learning is actually language. And what we find is that if children have got language gaps in the early years, I think we all understand that correlation between speech and language and literacy, and we're going to come to that in a bit. But I think one of the most fundamental links that people will make, but often don't make as much as we need to, is that correlation between language development, particularly conceptual understanding, and mathematical learning. So that in the early years, of course, at some point we've got to teach number recognition and the ability to order numbers, but that actually children need to understand those concepts in relation to real life and everyday experiences and daily routines before we can expect them to apply them to something more abstract, such as number.
Yeah. I think math is a particularly interesting one, because we do talk about things, as you've said there, more and less, and that can mean all sorts of things, doesn't it? Because if you say more milk is very different to have I got more pencils. Language and math is a very interesting link.
Oh, completely. And I think that's the difficulty of concepts. They are relative. So if somebody is sitting next to me at the snack table and has got just a tiny bit of milk in the bottom of their glass, but my glass is half full, then I have got more milk than Jack. But if Joshua is sitting next to me and his cup is filled to the top, then he's got more and I've got less. So, and it's a little bit like, my hair is short if you compare it to yours. Whereas if I was sitting next to my mum who's got really short hair, then I've got longer hair. So I think this is why concepts are really difficult, because they're not definite, they're not concrete. A pen is a pen and it's always a pen. And that's why children find nouns easier to learn, because they are what they are and you can see what they are. Whereas concepts are relative and can change depending on and that is why we cannot teach concepts just very quickly, and we cannot teach concepts just in one way, in one little focus activity, and then move on. We've got to teach them across many different experiences so that children can generalize that learning and see that there are many different applications. And, not wanting to jump the gun, but one thing that I talk about to people is, same and different are crucial concepts. And we often talk about things being the same shape or the same color or having the same number, which is fabulous. And I'm not saying people should stop doing that. But I often talk to people about, make sure you do things like, these ones sound the same, these ones sound different, so that these ones feel the same, these ones feel different, so that we don't also focus just on one sensory experience, as in same and different is only about things that we look at. Same and different can be about things that we hear, and things that we feel, or even things that we taste. And I obviously particularly focus on that auditory one because of the implications for literacy. But I do think we need to teach them in multiple ways, but also across multiple senses as well.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I know that the other thing you talk about is skills, that yours is a skills-based approach. So what are those skills that you're looking for in children?
Oh, gosh, lots and lots. And I suppose what I've tried to do with Launchpad is to kind of look at, well, when I was a therapist, when I went out into the nurseries in the Sunderland area, when I first met Claire Nicholson many moons ago and began to kind of have targeted conversations with children, do little assessments, but observe them in the learning environment. What is it exactly that I'm looking for? And the skills framework that underpins Launchpad is my way of trying to kind of plot that all out. And then also as well, not just what are the skills that I'm looking for as a speech and language therapist, but what are the skills as an early years practitioner that I'm needing children to have as they make that, ideally, that transition from spoken communication towards that readiness for literacy acquisition, not just readiness for phonics, but readiness for reading comprehension and writing. And because of the fact that we start our children very quickly in this country, I've got to really be very careful to put a lot of things in place, even when I've got children who haven't got any developmental gaps. So basically, we're looking for lots of things, and we can break speech and language. Speech and language is a huge area of communication down into many, many different skill areas, which are all plotted out. But I think the most fundamental thing that I'm looking for first and foremost is communication. That ability to tune into people, that kind of awareness of other people. So even with very young children, I'm seeing things like social referencing. So, I've dropped something, so I look to you to see if you're going to kind of do something about it. And I might point to get your attention. So even before most children have words, we see the emergence of that kind of turn taking, that social referencing. I might not be talking yet, but I go to try and get your attention, so that I'm aware that I can send out a specific signal. At this moment, it's a noise and it's non-verbal. But by doing so, I have that cause and effect relationship with you. I do something and I get a response from you. And this is all about, before the talk, this is about me understanding kind of communication. And I think it's really important that when we get children walking through our door who either aren't saying an awful lot, aren't engaging enough, that we first and foremost look to communication first. And it is also possible that I've got some children who have somehow managed the mechanics of learning to talk. But when I actually look at their core communication skills, they do lots of talking and lots of telling me, often about one specific subject. But when I actually say, is this a two-way process? If I say something to you, does that kind of make sense? That communication, so that's kind of in there. But then when you're then looking at the mechanics of listening and responding, we're obviously looking at those key auditory skills, those key receptive language skills, those skills that give me the ability to understand what you have said. So how do I trap what you've said? How do I process what you've said? So that would be auditory, then that would be receptive language. And then within receptive language, obviously, we've got another area which you can kind of think of separately, which is vocabulary. Receptive language, do I understand that sentence? Do I understand the grammar that you've used? Do I understand whether you're talking in the past or the future tense? But then also, do I understand those specific words, those vocabulary items that you've used? But also, do I have a vocabulary mechanism in the central store of my language where when you say a word, it makes me think of other words as well? So if you said, for example, apple, that straight away I know that it's something that I can eat. It's something that we have at the snack table. I know that it's an item of fruit. Does that kind of make sense? So that we think about words just as, does the child understand it? If I show them a picture or if I show them an object, can they name it or can they describe it? But actually, vocabulary development is much, much more complex than that. And it is knowing those words and having those connections between words, that it is that kind of semantic connection, those vocabulary skills that will underpin my imagination and my creativity, which is why we mentioned that could be problematic for children with language issues at the beginning. But it will also underpin my thinking skills, my problem solving skills, and also, of course, my ability to generate ideas and to think about something to say. And it is really in that semantic system, that vocabulary store, where most of my learning is housed. So, in schools at the minute, we talk a lot about, you shouldn't be focusing on skills, you should be focusing on knowledge. And for me, that is really difficult to sit, because actually it is only by having those auditory and those receptive language, those language processing skills, and then that vocabulary skills, those semantic skills, it is only by having those that I will be able to store knowledge. And then if we talk about it again tomorrow, if I've stored those new words and that new learning, for me, language and learning are very difficult to isolate out. And then you want me to remember and to tell you about what we did yesterday. That's all language skills as well. So I do think it's very difficult to have this dichotomy of a skill-based approach. Oh no, we should be having a knowledge-based approach, because actually knowledge is built on those language skills. And I think we really need to understand that in the early years. And that even when we make a shift to more knowledge-based learning in Key Stage 1, if you've still got children with language gaps, that push will be more problematic and it needs to be understood. And then obviously, once we've kind of found those words, I need to turn those ideally into word combinations, sentences. What grammar do I use? That's all expressive language. And then turn those actually into articulations of words, which is what we know of as speech. And kind of within all of that is a sub area of development called phonological awareness, which is where I become aware of words that rhyme, syllable structure, that certain words start with the same sound. And certainly in Launchpad, I kind of, in schools and nurseries, we look very much at phonological awareness as part of our phonic preparation, and rightly so. But actually, the primary purpose of phonological awareness is to underpin your speech sound development. So even though it's what we focus on for kind of pre-literacy, it's actually part of our speech and language mechanism as well. And then aside from that, which we've got symbolic skills, that ability that we have uniquely as humans, that one thing can represent another. So I can have a lump of plastic with some wheels on, and it's not a real car, but I can go brum, 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 because to me, my visual skills, but also my language skills and understanding of the notion of a car will allow me to begin to play with this object. So symbolic skills are part of language, but they also involve visual skills as well, and social communication. So that would be kind of so that's like pragmatic development, conversational skills, empathy and relationship skills. So that would be kind of what I would be looking at as a speech and language therapist. But also, if I'm thinking about what I would be wanting to see developing as I work towards literacy, we have to also consider visual and motor development as well. And I think that is something that we often don't factor in to our literacy preparation in the early years. We do a little bit of auditory, we focus a lot of phonological awareness. We don't do enough language, but what we don't certainly do is really factor in. I think we do lots on motor, but certainly in our learning environments and in our daily routines. But certainly having visual skills as a focus is not something that is at the forefront of everybody's mind. So Launchpad, I suppose, and the skills that I'm looking for, the vast majority are communication, speech and language, and that complexity within that area. But I have to be really aware, if I'm working towards literacy, of those other things.
So how do those skills feed into literacy?
Well, I think we've already touched on kind of phonological awareness, in that phonological awareness is that set of skills that allows children to be able to consider, to think about and make decisions about the structure of words, and when words are similar and when they're different. And that's like about rhyme and syllables and stuff. But I think for me, particularly when we're working on language all the time, it is not useful to compartmentalize. This is what I need to do to get my children ready for phonics. And oh my goodness me, I've got to do all of these separate things in order to work on language, because we've got lots of language issues this year. In that many of those language gaps that I'm concerned about will actually end up being foundation skill gaps for phonic readiness. And so if, certainly as I enter the school system, phonics is very important in the EYFS. It's certainly how our main measure of early literacy progression. Then yes, we need that kind of phonological awareness to be in place, but I need to be aware of those deeper foundation skills that many of my children won't have, but the conventional literacy preparation diet of do a little bit of listening and then turn to phonological awareness to be the main part of your diet actually misses out. And the first and foremost thing to think about is conceptual understanding. We've already touched on it a little bit about the implications for mathematical learning and progression. And I also touched on this notion of I need to, in the early years, consider that things can sound the same. They can sound different. They can sound nearly the same. And it will be that awareness of environmental sounds, animal sounds, transport sounds, but also that ability to understand those concepts of same and then different and then nearly the same about those sounds that I hear, that will actually allow me to move on to develop rhyming skills and to develop that ability to kind of listen more closely to parts of words. So it's really important in our literacy preparation that we are aware that conceptual demands are as important for literacy learning too. And certainly if we want our children to go into reception, or P1 if you're working in Scotland, or whatever, that transition year where you begin that kind of formal learning, if we want our children to do things like, say, for example, if you said, oh, pen, what sounds at the beginning of pen? Or if you said, oh, cat, what sounds at the beginning of cat? For some children, they'll be able to say you, oh, it's k. But for some children, you'll get because it's like, I'm not quite sure, so I'll just smile. And for other children, you'll get meow because it's like, I'm not
Yeah.
quite sure what you're talking about. I can't quite. And is it just that they can't hear the sound? But what I found, and I suppose this is kind of Launchpad emerged from my experience, but then from shared experiences as I worked with other people, that for many children who couldn't hear the sounds, the core issue was actually they didn't know what the beginning meant. So, even if you lined up some animal resources, a little line of three, and you said, oh, can you show me the animal at the beginning? It would have just been a case of pick an animal, any animal, not necessarily the one at the beginning. And then we're sitting them on the carpet and saying, what sounds at the beginning of pen? And if they could, they would probably love to say to you, I have got no idea what you're talking about. No idea what you're asking me to do. And so it comes across as, oh, they can't hear the sounds, but it's
Yeah.
actually an issue of comprehension. So I talk a lot to people about becoming more aware of language, not just so that they can become better communicators, of course that's important, but so that you can see those specific cause and effect links, those foundation skills that will impact on your ability to prepare children for phonics, but also then to move into literacy. So there's concepts that's really important, and things like up and down and round and across for future letter formation. But also the thing that we don't often consider is what I call auditory memory for understanding. So that ability to, as I get older, move from holding just one main word to 2 words to 3 words to 4 words. So this is part of receptive language, and its main purpose is to allow me, as I develop, to begin to be able to process your talk, you talking to me, as you begin to talk in gradually longer and longer sentences. It allows me to begin to process the language of stories. So it's a fundamental ability to process conversations and to process stories, this ability to hold kind of bigger and bigger chunks of language. And certainly a speech and language therapist would look at, well, how many keywords or how many information carrying words can a child hold, particularly if there are concerns there about comprehension and learning. Personally, as a teacher, I feel checking that auditory memory for understanding for all of your children is a really useful thing to do, because certainly what I found, and what lots of people who now go on to use Launchpad find, is that there are children who they think that skill will be okay because they're chatting, and they're doing okay in the early years. But when they actually look at it in more detail, there are those children with obvious gaps, and that it just helps to clarify what those gaps are, that process. Yes. But there are lots of children there with hidden gaps. And what we find is that children with those gaps, it will manifest as, I find it difficult to retell stories because actually I haven't been able to process and hold that language. I might have difficulties with following longer instructions and following explanations, remembering what to do after you've told me what to do. But when we hit literacy, people will say, oh gosh, he can't hold a sentence. And it's like, my first question is, well, what's his auditory memory for understanding like? And then the other thing is obviously that ability to blend as well, because as well as holding gradually more and more words, one thing that I began to look at more as a teacher that I didn't necessarily consider as a deal breaker issue as a therapist was this notion of, once I can hold 3 words, for example, can I now hold 3 words in the right order? And so if I had some animals and transport resources and I said, oh, can you make a line like this? Can you do bus, car, dog? Can you, from maybe a choice of 6 or 7, can you select the right 3, but most importantly, put the 3 in the right order? And what we find is that many of our children in reception and into Key Stage 1, or whatever you call those year groups, if you're working in a different country, what we find is that for many of those children who can't blend, if we do those tasks with them, they really struggle to hold the right number of words, or they can hold the right number of words, but not in the right order. So if they are hearing the right words, but not in the right order, when we are saying to them, what have I got in my bag? A crocodile. And this is one of the reasons why I can't blend is because I can't hold those three phonemes. And this is a
Yeah.
really important thing to know. And I think it's really important to factor that in to my literacy preparation. And by doing so, I can be preparing for phonics, but I can also be building language skills at the same time. So there is this no need to compartmentalize them out. But as a child gets older, my kind of hope is that what we try and stop doing in schools is when a child, for example, can't blend. We'll stick with this example because this example is such a common example out there. And after lockdown, unfortunately, I think it's going to be there for many more children. They can't blend. And so what we do is we feed them into a diet of just keep doing more and more blending, petting, petting. And for some children who are nearly there, they get it. But for many children, we get into this cycle with lack of progression. It can be very demoralizing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
actually, what we've never done, and at the same time, we'll be saying, oh gosh, he can't remember what to do when he gets back to the table. Because at the same time, we've never kind of uncovered that this child actually has an issue with auditory memory, holding words and holding words in the right order. So, of course, they can't hold phonemes and hold phonemes in the right order. And that's why he can't remember what to do when he goes to the table. And I think this greater awareness is for me, it's about fairness to that child. It's about giving people the ability to look in more detail at children that nobody else is telling them to look in more detail at. Oh, just keep doing it, just keep doing it. And it's like, actually, developmentally, it's a bit more complex than that. And there might be a different solution to this problem. And you know, getting that child to make progress, and for the school that's important to kind of get those phonic outcomes, but most importantly to give that child what they need, and to get that diet of what needs to happen for that child more right from a developmental point of view.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, you've said there, children are very complex beings. It is quite difficult. And it is that lovely moment when you realise, you think, oh, that's what it is. But that can be quite challenging, especially if you're in a school and you've got a class of 30 and you say loads of things going on at the moment. How can we identify those difficulties when maybe things aren't going quite according to plan?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to have an understanding of child development and understand what those skills are and how those skills develop. So, you know, somebody like me, if I had a cohort of 30, I would want to look at all of my children in that way. You know, I couldn't not look at my children in that way. You know, you can take a therapist out of the speech and language therapy department, but you can't actually take that way of thinking is ingrained. And then obviously going into teaching, I learned a lot more as well, and different things, but that thinking was still there. But actually, let's be realistic. And I think it's about that understanding of child development, what all the different skills are, how they develop, so that actually when a child walks through my door where they are obviously not where they need to be, I've got somewhere to go to say, right, okay, what I don't want to do is to fall into this trap of, and they can't do that, and they can't do that, and they can't do that. And I can get where people are coming from when we make those comments. But actually, what I need to do is I need to have that knowledge and understanding so they can say, yes, but they can do this. And therefore, their next step would be this, and then their next step. So that what I have is I have a real aspirational kind of attitude to these children, but it begins by going back, establishing a level of success, and then say, right, okay, we are going to move you to your next steps if we can. And for some children, obviously, progress is particularly problematic alongside specific, but for most children, we can have that very progressive edge. But it doesn't begin by push at what I want you to do, but you can't do. It begins by going back. So I think if there are lots of children, and if we've got lots going on, and we've got the phonics agenda, and we've got this, you know, all of this kind of recovery curriculum agenda and all the rest of it, then I think I have to kind of say, right, choose my battles. Who would really benefit from me looking at them more closely? And in order to kind of work out what I need to do to close a gap, how can I do that before I've identified and clarified where that gap is and what I need to do in order to close that gap? So I think people are put under huge pressure to close these gaps, But if that process doesn't begin with a bit of gap identification, you're just throwing things at these children, very well intentioned. I'm not, I'm not being awful here. The whole kind of process can become much more informed if we just understand what we're dealing with a little bit more. And certainly there are some schools who use Launchpad, for example, where their school improvement agenda is phonics. And yes, it will help them look at language, it will help them. But again, what they do is say, right, we're going to really just focus to begin with on the skills that feed directly into phonic readiness. And then once that becomes automatic to us, once that becomes ingrained into our curriculum and our approaches, then we'll shift our focus elsewhere. So I would say, you've got the ideal world case scenario, but I would also say choose who and choose what you want to look at more closely. This is a tool. It's a learning. I don't like the phrase journey, but it is a learning journey for staff as well as for children. And I think choose your battles. The only thing that I would say is just be really cautious about hidden gaps. I've got lots of children in the early years who have got elements of disordered language development, and academically that often doesn't cause a problem. And if it's higher level kind of disorder, doesn't cause a problem often until key stage 1. And then they often flag themselves up as having reading comprehension problems and beginning to find social things sometimes a bit more awkward as the other children progress. And actually those children's very patchy and, gaps, that kind of really, really spiky developmental profile was there all the time in the early years. I could see it in their play. I could see it in their interactions. It just wasn't really measured. And then we hit that reading comprehension wall, and it's like, oh, he's got a reading comprehension problem. It's like, well, of course he has a problem inferring meaning and predicting when he's reading something. But actually, if we just talked about that, he would have a problem as well. This is actually a language issue that is manifesting as a reading comprehension issue. It's just the first time we've measured it or addressed it. And so, yes, look at those children who are walking through your door with what we traditionally call low starting points. But also be aware of those children with hidden gaps who, I think they're going to be okay, because there are a lot of children like that, or those children who appear that they're ready for phonics, but actually I'm really good at learning my letters, but I just can't blend because you hadn't realized that I've got that auditory memory problem there. It's good enough to get by in conversations and chat, but actually if you look at the really picky sequential skills, it's nowhere near as good as you suspected it was.
Yeah. Wow. That's really, really interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's loads and loads of great advice there already, Kirstie. But if I had to sort of pin you down to one or two top tips or top strategies for early years practitioners and teachers, educators who are working with children for speech and language, specifically thinking about literacy, what would your top tip or your top piece of advice be for them?
It's very difficult to give one.
I thought it might be.
It depends what kind of speech and language gap it is. But I think my biggest area to consider after you've looked at your children are your interactions. If you understand your children more, what does that mean? Does it mean that for certain children, when you talk to them, you have to simplify your language? Because actually, if you speak in longer sentences, they're not able to process them. But don't be too simple. Make sure that you are being progressive as well. So don't simplify your language too much, because they still need to learn how to understand more. Think about, those children who struggle to understand or maybe tune into your face and your voice still, still kind of implementing strategies like being face to face with them, so being opposite them when you're engaged in interactions in different areas, so rather than dropping in next to them. And then which children it's a case of actually I need to be really careful to model certain key vocabulary or certain grammatical structures, because actually they're still saying her this, him that. So I need to make a point in my interactions to say, oh, look at Joshua, he's on the bike. he's on the red bike, isn't he? So that I've used Joshua's name just to kind of clarify we're talking about Joshua right now. But then I use very kind of specifically that pronoun he, more because I'm kind of really modeling the use of that, because that's the grammatical immaturity, the grammatical gap that I've noticed that that child has. So my strategy is about consider your interactions, but within that, that could be many different things. But what I find is that because we've fallen into this trap of, to deal with speech and language issues, to deal with the fact that most people have a level of concern about 50% of their children in this area, often the percentage is higher, particularly in areas of deprivation. We have a little bit falling into this trap of implementing something. So I have no problem at all with these kind of what I would call intervention programs. So it could be I Can Early Talk Boost, it could be Nelly, which is being kind of pushed by the DFE and reception at the minute. But I think what it does for me as a practitioner is it's like, I need something to fix this, something that is separate from everything else that I do. And I'm not saying don't do those things, but don't see those are only just one small part of your toolbox. And the biggest tool that you've got in your toolbox is yourself, your interactions, the language that can come out your mouth, the structures that you can model, the way you can go back, the way you can progress. And I just think because we often look for these external solutions, we kind of miss the trick that the biggest tool in this gap filling box is the adults, the practitioners, and the role that they play. And that begins to get that right. You need to know your children. The more you know your children, the better you can get that. And it's kind of that double edge. But for me, the biggest intervention tool is your interactions in child initiated learning, but also don't forget those daily routines as well.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That is fantastic. And then you've just touched on something else there as well. Parents, obviously, parents have and this last year they've had an even bigger input. So, what's the role of parents in this?
Well, I think parents, lockdown aside, even if schools and nurseries were open all of the time, they are children's primary language facilitators. They have their children much more than we do, weekends, school holidays, mornings, evenings. So I think, they are children's primary language facilitators. And as childcare providers, practitioners, teachers, then we can see ourselves as what we would call secondary language facilitators. We become the next main role. So obviously, we need to get what we do right, because our role is massively, massively valuable. And the more we know about speech and language, the more we can get that role really right. But I also think we need to be aware of the impact that language experience, that language care that children get within the home environment, the reality of the impact that has. So where possible, we need to, if we're having concerns that that's not as good as it would ideally be, to use our knowledge and our understanding to support parents with that process. And certainly in a lot of local authorities, or a few local authorities that I'm working in already, we're looking at kind of using Launchpad within settings and obviously schools, but settings that kind of to get in as early as possible, but that speech and language therapy, inclusion services, but also health visitors and family support workers would be involved in that process, so that it all centres on that setting, understanding more, getting their practice really targeted, but actually to then also use that understanding to be able to work more closely with parents. And I think we also need to understand that even a parent who would be giving a child a really language rich experience, if you've got a child with specific needs, language disorder, or a predisposition to a language delay, then a little bit of advice and a little bit of support is always useful, because not because you've done something wrong, but because the child has got that predisposition to either delay or disorder. And what I would hope that Launchpad and that greater understanding does is it gives practitioners that ability to make that advice a bit more specific, that support to be a bit more specific to parents, particularly when there are speech, language, and communication needs. But also, as well as giving advice, I can begin that whole conversation by saying, do you know what we've noticed is really good at doing this, or when we do it like this is and I always think that those conversations need to begin with a celebration of success, particularly when we've got children with speech, language, and communication needs. So yeah, parents are massively important. And I suppose one of the concerns about lockdown, it's, let's be real, is that we are concerned about the number of children who won't have been bathed in stories and language, who will have spent too much time on the iPad and in front of the telly, often in isolation. And we have to be aware of the impact of that. But when we're thinking about closing that gap, first of all, we have to identify what that gap is. But what we cannot do within our settings and schools is replicate that time. We can't replicate that term or 2 terms of nursery that the child hasn't had. We just can't do that. It's just not physically possible unless you've got a time machine. But what we can do is be aware of the developmental gaps that lack of experience has created, and say, in a real focused way, how are we going to deal with this? And a lot of people are talking, and I would completely agree with them, that the vast majority of gaps will be language gaps, and there'll be social communication gaps. So although there'll be a lot of pressure to get the numeracy and the phonics up to speed, that actually it will be those social communication, those language and those semantic skills that we talked about right back at the beginning, that will have the biggest implication for long-term social and academic success. And it's about making sure that when I do try to kind of think, right, well, what experiences am I going to put in place for these children to close that gap, I have a clear intention of exactly what I'm trying to achieve.
Wow, that is so interesting. And as you say, I think it's been a very interesting time, and I think the way that things are going to roll out when we do go back to everybody being back in school, I think we're going to find some very, very interesting gaps. So from a social experiment, one we wouldn't want, but we have. So it'd be very interesting to keep an eye on that, and just to see where children have got those gaps and what has happened to development in the last sort of 12 months or so. Yeah. And support parents, as you say.
And also be aware that some children might have got more out of the experience.
yes,
because of the one-to-one time and the one-to-one attention that they might have had. So we're going to have a real kind of mixed bag. Unfortunately, I think the children that I've just mentioned will be less. They'll be much smaller in number. But I think, we have to acknowledge that being in that home environment and having more time from our parents, if our parents are spending that time and doing the right things, can have had a positive impact as well. But unfortunately, I think we'll be more concerned about the other one to notice that other one too much.
Well, of course. Yes, absolutely. Well, Kirstie, it's just so interesting talking with you. Just some really, really eye-opening things there, stuff that I've not thought about at all. And of course, a lot about Launchpad. So where can we find out more about Launchpad? Tell us all about it.
Oh, well, Launchpad, there is a website that you can go on, which is www.launchpadforliteracy.co.uk. And probably the main place to kind of look at is to go into the find out more section and to look at the case studies, because ultimately, I think the most important thing before you kind of look at, well, what can I buy and what do you get, is, well, why would I possibly want to take it on? But certainly if you were looking at something for CPD, for identification, but also it's very much an approach. It's not like really a program. It's a set of supporting documents that you would get, and it's about helping you with that CPD, that identification process, but also to drive the detail of your targeted practice and what we would call your quality first teaching. It's not an intervention program at all. It's about trying to weave this greater developmental understanding into your everyday practice and to embed those interventions. So really, the website would be the main place to go. Within there, you would get my contact details. So if you wanted me to contact me, I would be able to kind of send you little videos and a bit more information. I must say, unless I really kind of up my game before the summit is available in the public domain, the website is very much a work in progress. So if you're interested and you can't get what you need from there, because I need to do a lot on it, well, not me personally, but I need to do things so that somebody else can do that, is to contact me. And also, as well as, you know, Launchpad is used across the country pretty much now. So there probably will be somebody relatively nearby, if you're in England, who might be using it, so that I could kind of direct you to a network of people. That would be the best. But the best thing to do would just be to contact me, really.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. And I'll make sure that those links are in the words that go along with the video, so you can click through and have a look. And I totally empathise about websites in progress. All of my websites are still in progress. That's a common thing. That's what they're all about.
Well, mine's been in progress for quite a long time, and I'm afraid the spanner in the wheel, so to speak, is me. But I always have other priorities, Kathy. Always have other priorities.
Absolutely. The children come first. Well, Kirstie Page, it is so interesting talking with you. Thank you very, very much indeed for sharing your expertise and your knowledge all about language, speech, communication, and those links with literacy and with maths and everything else. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming on the Early Years Summit today and discussing all of those things with us.
No problem, and thank you.
You're most welcome. And I look forward to welcoming everybody to the next session on the Early Years Summit, all about speech, language and communication.
ship alone.